Hello, everybody. Looks like we've got the participants starting to file in now. Give it a few seconds here. Starting to count up. All right. So it looks like we've got a full house. Oh, a few more folks joining. Give it just another minute. People coming back from lunch, I guess. All right. So hello, everyone. My name's Chris Pattison. I actually work with Archer Integrated Risk Management. Super excited to be presenting today. My wife is actually from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, so very familiar with the area. I've been told, though, I need to get to Winnipeg to do some fishing, so super excited about that. My role within Archer is I'm an executive director with the Risk Transformation Office, and what that is a set of executives that work with our larger customers. But my background was with FedEx previous to Archer, and stood up their risk management program on the platform. And so this is where risk quantification was something I really started getting into about 4 or 5 years ago, especially as it relates to some of the challenges we see, in cybersecurity, in the risk management arena. And it's a really hot topic that I've continued to work on, and we'll get into some of those details. So super excited, and we will go ahead and start sharing here. So we're going to talk about why risk quantification is not as hard as it seems. And this is what I run into with a lot of our customers, is it can be a challenge to figure out how to start to actually quantify risk for an organization. And it really is a journey, ties as much into culture and the risk culture of an organization, how to start to mature that, even before you get into talking about the different tools and capabilities that are out there. But, these are typical, just another day in security for a lot of us, right? So you get discussions with executives, and they're like, you want to spend how much on security? I'd rather give those dollars to marketing. Why do you need all these countermeasures for your program? Although with the headlines today, it might be a little bit easier. This is another one. Yeah, a lot of CISOs and executive leadership, there are two options, right? So it's do I need that new gateway? Do I need the SIM? There's so many different countermeasures that can be deployed to mitigate different risks. How do you start to evaluate what I call the return on control or return on countermeasure? I did say return on investment at one time, and I was very quickly corrected by one of our finance team members that I was a cost center, had no business talking about ROI. So we started using the term return on countermeasure was a good way to talk about it. But how do you look at those trade-offs? How do you look at that in a true dollar value? And then this is if you're familiar with Jack Jones and the FAIR Institute and the work there, this is really the question that triggered him to take his journey with risk quantification, because it was the question the board asked him, are we secure enough? And he kind of looked at them and he was like, well, I don't think I've got the data to answer that question, and set him on the quest, if you're familiar with it, to actually create open, fair, and start to dive into risk quantification for cybersecurity. And then the answer usually is, yeah, you cross your fingers and tell the board, yeah, we're secure enough, but I might need a little bit more budget for this program or that program. So it's kind of two sides of that same coin. And then I saw this, even as we started doing some of this work at FedEx, is literally two team members fighting over, which project makes you more secure, based on a certain amount of capital outlay or some type of investment in that countermeasure. You get two folks fighting over it. The CISO is trying to make a decision. How do you get to that from that perspective? So all very common questions that start to lead us into, hey, we need a better way of quantifying these things than some of the methods that we're currently using from a risk perspective. And then if you look at that just across, if you look at what we have to deal with in the cybersecurity domain as a CISO, the number of responsibilities and subdomains within that group is quite complex and a little bit overwhelming. So if you're trying to do trade-offs between all these different things, it would help to have a set of metrics and a way to actually measure it and align with that. So core concept one that we'll discuss here, and anybody that's been in business long enough, that the measurement gives you control. I pulled this quote out from James Harrington, and it really leads to you have to have that measurement to get that control, to get that level of improvement. And if you can't measure it, you can't understand it. So, and many times it's frustrating to me when I go into security organizations and they're still either doing just ordinal heat maps. They're doing things like just kind of guessing it. This looks like a good product. It's going to support my organization and reduce the risk. But there really is a lack of measurement around it. So that's one of the core concepts around why organizations are starting to explore this concept of doing risk quantification at a deeper level within these different domains. And then this is also key too, is to get that funding. It's always easier to align with the business, right? And growth is never by mere chance. It's forces working together. It's alignment with the different business units. And guess what? If you're talking in terms that their projects are usually justified in, right? So that's typically return on investment and true dollar investment in programs and projects. Getting aligned with the business and having that discussion makes all those kinds of conversations a lot easier. And if you go out there and look at core concept number 3, like speaking same language in security, I did a quick Google search on that, and it came up with 670,000 some results. So it's clearly a topic that comes up constantly. It's like, oh, we've got to speak the language of the business. We need to have an ontology or way to better communicate with them. And so that's a big part of getting started with risk quantification, is to have that common ontology and way to discuss when you're looking at cybersecurity risks, or for that matter, any particular risk in general. Go to the next one. So here's a trick question, and some of you that are practitioners may already have seen this before in some other organizations. Let me pop my chat up here so I can see this. But look at this list really quick, right? So we've got about 10 different items here, and so I encourage everybody to open up the chat room and we can see what people are thinking. How many of these things are actually all risks? Are all of them risks? Or half of them, 25%? Go ahead and take some time to type that in the chat panel. You can get to that through your control bar right there at the bottom. But I'm curious, we've got 70-some people in here. What does the audience think? Are these all risks? Some, all, getting a lot of all votes? No other takers? 80 people in the room? Everybody's quiet in Canada today? Here we go. Oh, can't see the questions. You're using your phone. Yeah, you'd have to be on the screen. Angie's got an interesting observation here. So we've got some feedback that's starting to come in. I'm going to give you a little hint here. So we're all kind of long-standing risk practitioners. Let's go back to the core definition of risk, right? It's some probability or likelihood that something's going to happen, and there's some magnitude that's tied to that risk. So does that help anybody? Well, so some of you may have already been through this exercise, but actually none of them are, right? And the reason is, if you start to look at it, can you actually assign a magnitude to it? And is there a probability that you can assign to that risk? And if you start to look at this, it can't be done. And so when I work with a lot of customers, what I find out, there was a bank in Singapore in particular I was working with, and the CISO said, oh my God, I've got, 100 some new risks tied to this new, they had their privacy regulation that came out. And I told her, I said, there's no way. There's only one real risk here. And she's like, how do you figure that? And I said, look, the only real risk is if that regulator shows up and a fine is levied, against you, right? So that's the magnitude. And then we got into a little bit deeper discussion on how you would determine the probability of that. And that really is kind of the environment and the regulatory environment. Are they going after, similar organizations of your size? Is there, kind of rampant fines out there in the market already that you can see because all those things are published? So you could start to get to, on an annual basis, there's a chance that we will have a regulator come in here, in the next 5 years or so, would be a good likelihood or probability you could start with. And then based on their risk posture, they could probably estimate, looking at other regulatory fines that have been levied, as to what that magnitude may be, right? So that's a good example of looking at something that it has to have those two components around that, right? And if you're familiar with talking about ontologies, this is actually the top level of the open, fair standard that's out there. If you're not familiar with it, with the open group, it really is the top, right? So this is when you're dealing with other organizations and they may come back and say, well, I can't assign a probability of this, or I can't assign a magnitude. What you're really looking at that point, it's probably not a risk, and you may need to work with that member of the first line of defense and have a bit of a deeper discussion on clarification. Right. So, for example, we'll take the first one. Like, cloud computing itself is not a threat, right? It's a platform. Insider threats and attack vector. If you go down through the rest of the list, and some of the folks, threw this out there. But now let's take a cloud computing example. If I said, I'm worried about, I'll go back to my FedEx days, FedEx shipping running in a cloud environment, and it's down for 3 days, right? So I start to get to scenario. That's the way you want to start to look and examine risks in your risk register and to set those up. So really what we look at, and a lot of our partners do this as well, is starting to clean up these risk registers, right? So for each risk, like we were saying, can you estimate the loss magnitude? And it's very easy if you're dealing with a business and trying to get these estimates, assign that probability to be, something on an annualized basis, right? So likely to happen in the next 3 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years. And again, there's a lot more. I'm a big fan of Doug Hubbard. If you're not familiar with Doug's work in How to Measure Anything, you can usually go out and survey the landscape and get a decent idea of what that looks like from a likelihood. And then even if folks are coming to you with some of the things that you saw on the previous page, that's still useful information. So even with that CISO in Singapore, we sat down and looked at it and what they had in their risk register. There was a lot of useful data that would help derive either that probability or loss magnitude. So it wasn't a lost exercise, but the classification of what they had in their risk register, actually tied to other things. And that's what you want to do, is to go in, clean up your risk register, and make sure that what you're actually looking at are risks with some level of frequency and magnitude. And also working back to one of the core concepts, right? Core concept 2 and 3, aligning and speaking the language of the business, set this up as a scenario template. So it's describing the threat community or the threat or the risk, as an actor, or what is acting on that system. What is the actual asset that's in jeopardy? What is the dollar value? If that asset goes down from a loss perspective, if it's actually something you're going to have to replace, what is the threat, or what's actually acting, against that asset? And then what are the overall effects? Because that's going to help you start to quantify it. And it's funny that I wrote this up like years ago, and actually we went through this scenario up in Calgary a while back because they wanted to look at it kind of in terms of, could you do this on operations as well? I said, well, sure, why not? So you could say a very simple scenario to work with a business, a nation state, the asset at risk is pipeline infrastructure. The threat type is a Triton exploit, so kind of what you're dealing with from a threat perspective. And then you could look at what the impact would be from a business perspective. Hey, if this happens to us and we can't recover very quickly, we could have the pipeline down for 2 days, depending on what they could do from a risk perspective. Could they actually cause a spill? And now you're actually starting to lay out actual scenarios that can be quantified. These can be adjusted based on, the realistic expectations and the things you can learn from the business. These are not always things we immediately understand, but they could say, that's ridiculous. That wouldn't happen. It'd be more of scenario A or B. So these scenarios can be created and tied back to your risk register to get a better understanding of what that potential business impact is and start to derive both that probability and magnitude. So what we're doing here, obviously this can be decomposed down into real dollar values. It can be annualized on a loss expectancy. And now you can start to get into, if I'm going to put countermeasures in to prevent this exploit, what is the return on countermeasure or control? Or if I have multiple countermeasures, how can I do a cost-benefit analysis and a trade-off that, maybe doing some type of sandbox environment versus, diodes out in the OT environment. There are all these different methods out there that you can explore. Here's a way that as you start to get into this, you can start to look at the level of impact and ability to improve the ability to mitigate that actual risk. So really when I go in and work with organizations, this is a journey, right? And it's a journey of increased control, increased measurement. All of us are very, very, very familiar with the Ordinal Heat Map. There's quite a bit of discussion and even some research out there. If you Google the risk of risk matrices, there are at least 7 mathematical biases tied to using these ordinal charts and just doing kind of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rankings for severity and probability that can actually lead you to make some very dangerous decisions, right? Because when you say severe and don't assign some level of magnitude, actual magnitude to it, what does that actually mean for the organization? And it's very hard for folks to understand and agree. We actually had a situation one time in front of executives where 2 people couldn't remember why we picked significant because they asked us, they said, well, you have this as very likely and significant. What does significant mean? And 2 people gave 2 completely different answers and did not have our teams looking very good. It was 2 different director teams using different scales here. So typically what I say is start to move into what I call a semi-quantitative or interval-based matrix. And it's real simple, right? Just as we were talking about in the previous conversation, add some ranges to that severity from a dollar value perspective. And then on your likelihood, same type of idea, it's going to happen greater than 10 times a year, once a year. And these can be varied. We've had discussions with organizations, maybe for a business unit, $100 million, between a $1 million and $100 million loss is a lot. But if you get up to a multinational corporation, that doesn't start to make sense until it's in multiple hundreds of millions. So you can also scale these based on the size of the business unit you're working with. But guess what? Because you're using actual dollar values and actual likelihoods here, you can start to look at this and add up where these risks start to fall as you scale things up and bring different parts of the organization together to get an enterprise view. So if it's a failure at multiple facilities, if it's different levels from infrastructure, things along that line, it gives you the ability to have a bit more insight. So it's really simple to add these things to, even if you're not using a tool like Archer to do this and you're doing it in spreadsheets, it will change the conversations within your organization because they get much more in depth. And when we got into this in some of my previous roles, there were discussions like, wow, how do you think that's $100 million? And you actually have to now start to back up your assumptions with some real data, and it will improve your overall ability to assess the overall risk of the organization. What you've also done, though, is you're picking these ranges and you're picking actual values. You can start to run this through a fairly high-level Monte Carlo triage, and at that point, you can actually get these loss exceedance curves through running simulations. My background was originally industrial engineering and quality control statistics, so we would do a lot of these probability simulations to look at different impacts of things flowing through the shop floor. Well, guess what? We can do the same thing and use those same very, very common mathematical tools to actually get good distributions around what we believe our risk to be. And open fair takes us a little bit further. I see a lot of organizations that'll do this first level of triage and then say, hey, you know what? We really need to look at these top 2 or 3. We've got some serious issues here. and then they will start to use the open fair method, where you're not only doing a deeper level of simulation around the ability to impose different countermeasures against those different threats, but then you can start to do trade-off, right? So here's an example of below where that was the inherent risk, and the residual risk is I impose those countermeasures and actually start to run the math on what the different scenarios could be as you go through the organization. And there are tools that provide this now. The Open Fair group actually has a free spreadsheet. If you join up to the society, you can see kind of how some of this stuff starts to work. What's happening, though, is this kind of advanced side of modeling is starting to sneak mainly into cyber for the folks in the room that may deal with critical infrastructure, oil and gas. The bow tie model is probably quite familiar to you. I'm seeing it move into cyber more now because we look at what's going on with ransomware and this concept of it's almost more important on how we analyze what happens, quote unquote, right of bang. If we have that event, how quickly can we recover? What investments and tools do I need to actually facilitate that recovery? Are there multiple paths or options I have at that point? So again, very common in critical infrastructure where these things have to be brought back up online or contain something that may pose risk to human life. So we're seeing, at least in my space, more movement into using bow ties even in the cybersecurity space, but also where this has also been fairly qualitative, doing the same type of thing, running simulations on each of the different forks here in the bow tie and getting some actual simulated results from those countermeasures. So again, FAIR typically is a little bit more of what are the proactive controls and how do they work? And if you get into the more advanced levels of doing bow tie analysis, you can start to look at the reactive controls and what their impact is to your overall risk posture. And the interesting thing about bow ties, if you've worked with them at all, they can be nested, and events can cascade on top of each other because one critical event may lead to two or three others. So there's a lot of flexibility and dynamics in this. It's an emerging space in cyber, but again, the health and safety folks in the risk world are quite familiar with this. So if you're lucky enough to have some of those folks in your organization, good teams to go kind of talk about how they're doing some of this analysis. And then the model risk has been out there much more, see some of that out in the financial institutions when they're forecasting financial models. So some very advanced tools and capabilities within those groups. So if you're looking at a risk management program from an enterprise perspective, if you have those teams, you probably have more expertise than you realize you have. You go start to talk to the individuals in those different organizations. So generally, when I start to look at starting that journey, it really is to start with that semi-quantitative interval-based set of estimations. And the goal there, again, as you're going through this, and it's tough, right? Because we deal a lot with engineers. They want to be very precise. But what you'll learn is as you start to do this is you want a level of accuracy, right? So if you go over to the marketing group, even when they're rolling out a new product line or something like that, and I did that for years as well, they're educated guesses, right? So they're trying to accurately set a forecast of, how well a product is going to do in the market or something along that line. But even then, they may have some precision, but it's not an engineering level of precision a lot of times in those forecasts. And so what we need to do as risk practitioners, it's better to get an accurate precision, an accurate measurement. Even if you don't have a super high level of precision, it's better than not having anything at all. And again, it works really well to feed those ranges into these Monte Carlo simulations where you can actually get some feedback. And if it's not accurate or if it's not precise enough, in some cases I've gone back to management and said, look, I need to invest in data set X or Y, and it's going to cost you this, but I can get you a more precise number. I just don't have that data readily available. So again, a cost benefit analysis, if I'm looking at a $2 or $3 million program and the data set to get more precise is going to cost me $500,000, there may be a question of do we want to make that investment or not? So that's a big part of when you start kind of going down this route of adding these estimates even in the semi-quantitative interval-based models. But now you're really, when you're doing this and you're starting down, even on that first level, you're now talking in dollar values, you're talking in annual occurrences. These are things that, are already probably if you're a public company, in your annual reports and in your filings, with the different agencies. So it's a common language that leadership, the board of directors, will understand on the business side. It opens up the ability to discuss these risks in something they understand. And then again, using that term with them, say, hey, for this investment, if we're looking to actually mitigate this risk or maybe even transfer it through insurance, here's what the return on the control or countermeasure will be. Again, maybe your organization lets you get away with saying return on investment on a control, but I have not had much success with that. So I typically use return on control or countermeasure in my discussions. And then what you do, and I've seen, this is a couple of Fortune 500s, they'll start kind of more on this left side to do that triage, right? So if you're following any of the common risk management frameworks, there's that discovery and initial analysis step. Those are typically done on the left side of the diagram. And then as you start to tease out, hey, this looks like it has significant impact to my organization, then you may go do something like an open fair model or maybe even a bow tie, depending on what the overall impact is. And that's why I think a lot of organizations think some of these concepts are far too complicated, and that they go out and say, well, we're going to run open fair on every risk we've got. Well, if something is on the borderline of an accepted risk, or if you go back to your heat map and it's kind of in that marginal area, there's no reason to run a full Monte Carlo or full open fair analysis on this, because it's probably not a massive impact to your organization. If you've got some sense of what the dollar values are as you've had those discussions with the first line of defense, say those advanced tools for the bigger risk items, the bigger ticket items, maybe where you have to have some significant investment in the countermeasures there, and then ease into it. Over time, maybe you can run it on more scenarios, but focus on the things that make the most impact. And you'll also notice that the discussion with your executives will start to change as you start to talk in true dollar values. And then, like we said, bow tie is unique. It really does start to dig into, if it looks like we're going to get hit with ransomware and there's not much we can do on the preventative side, it's almost inevitable. How are we going to focus our resources on recovery and bringing that operation back up, especially if it does get into your operational infrastructure, if you're manufacturing or logistics, or in kind of one of those areas where there's a heavy operational component. I suppose it could be within the finance side as well. So what does this do, right? Think about how this now changes our conversations, right? So here's the big boss again. He wants to say, hey, you want to spend how much? How different is the conversation if I say, I did a deeper analysis on this, and it looks like there's a $300 million annualized loss, and we're looking at a countermeasure investment that will reduce that to 50 million on investment of 6, right? So all of a sudden, I'm now talking in terms that those executives can understand. Sure, you're going to get, just like a product manager taking a new product to market, they're going to push back on these numbers. You're going to have to go back through and discuss what your assumptions were and how you got there. But these are common discussions the leadership teams are very familiar with, happen every day in product marketing, happen every day in other parts of the business. If you're looking at making an operational investment in expanding a factory or kind of retooling, very common discussions. And what it does is now you're on their level and able to have those discussions where it may have been a bit more difficult because you're using things like, well, it's very severe and very likely. It's a 5 and a 5. It's like, what does that mean? And here's our poor CISOs. All of a sudden they can start to look at, hey, the simulations are showing that the email gateway provides, better reduction in residual risk or improvement in the residual risk, versus the investment in the SIM. With our limited budget, that's where we should start. So you can start to look at that based on costing and what to do. I've seen, again, from my background in industrial engineering, I've seen some very cool models out of the universities where they're actually running linear programs to optimize that investment. So let's say you go ask for your budget from the CFO, And they say, well, that's nice, Chris. You want 100 million, we're going to give you 50. It'll actually optimize and go through and look at those controls and help you figure out if I have to spread that $50 million out, how do I spread that out across that? So again, some very interesting developments in the whole world of starting to apply some of this risk quantification to operational problems. And then, right, there's the whole new day in security of, are we secure enough? Yeah, or I think we are. This is really where integrated risk management and enterprise risk management are playing in, is as you have these actual dollar numbers, I can start to roll that up across the enterprise. I can roll up cyber next to operational risk, next to financial risk, and I can start to look and really have some good discussions on, are we okay here? This is where our existing investment is going to reduce our exposure by $2 billion on an annualized basis. So you can start having these discussions if you're building and starting with that foundation from where you should build out from. And these are conversations I'm seeing more companies start to have as they're getting these integrated risk management and enterprise risk management programs in place. So the key takeaways for everybody, and then please, we'll open up the chat room and kind of the Q&A here. I prefer to use the chat. It's a little bit more fluid. Focus on those core concepts. You want to get the ability to get measurement in place, and that's going to give you more control over the risk within your organization. Seek to start using the dollar values as well as the likelihood estimates to align with the business. And speak the language and ideally adopt some type of standard risk ontology. I tell a lot of folks that even if you're not going to use the mathematics behind open fair, if you go look at it, it gives you really good ontology and a place to start those conversations with your business units. And whether or not that's a cyber risk, you can look at the FAIR model and easily replace it with other operational terms that'll fit. And I know that the Open Group is expanding that model also into the operational domain. I think there's some work going around on that right now if you're interested in contributing. But have that ontology. It's really bad. And it goes back to, what is the difference between significant and severe? Even on the old ordinal scale models, you're getting into a lot of risk if you don't have some level of definition around that. Two people may have a vastly different view and bias on what that looks like. And potentially, if you're rolling those things up, it could lead you to some poor decisions around your risk posture. Again, using those scenario descriptions, that template is out there to show you how that was formatted. And then, leaders, if you're a leader within the organization, adding those dollars and likelihoods to your current heat maps, very simple. Something you can mandate for your different teams and in organizations. And if you're just a practitioner, on the call today, I'll tell you, it'll change the conversation. Even if you start out and you're a small project team and you bring your risks back, when they give you a regular 1 through 5, just assign the values and say, hey, this is really where I think this falls. And the conversations with your leadership will change. You'll start to really drill down into what the actual exposure is. And then you're really having a true risk discussion. So, back to the initial topic, that this isn't as complicated as a lot of folks think it is. Just this very simple step of adding these ranges and quantitative pieces to your existing risk registers is very valuable in starting that journey. Because what happens is inevitably the next question is, well, I want to know more about that. And that's really how I got into this back in my previous role. Vice President did ask, he said, well, this particular issue, how big is it really, and what can we do about it? And we started doing some prototype and some work around the FAIR models to work with the organization. And they were very happy with the results. We went back and presented. There was some debate around how we did our estimates, but when I said, we used your marketing team, we used customer service, we used all the resources we had, and we all agreed on these ranges and values together as a group, then he was like, okay, let's do this. And we made some investment in some countermeasures on a data science perspective to solve that particular problem. So again, that's an easy place to start and a good place to do it. So, this is I got to plug our platform a little bit. Some of you are probably familiar with it already. We manage these risk registers and a lot of these different data elements. We have questionnaire engines to help do the assessment and data collection around this. Smaller organizations, you could probably do it on a spreadsheet, but at some point you'll realize as you start to build out those inventories, start to work through the math, having some tooling behind that is very useful. We are making significant investments, chasing and starting to align with this integrated risk management perspective. That risks aren't separated like they used to be, right? A cyber attack and ransomware, just as we saw this week, can very quickly bleed over into an operational impact. So looking at your investment, looking at your countermeasures in these different domains to roll that up and make this a higher level discussion with leadership is quite valuable. So I'll drop it there. That's kind of the one plug I had. You can follow me at Risk Wrangler on Twitter. I'm all over LinkedIn. I would have had my white Calgary hat on today, but didn't quite fit in. I'm on the road today, so it was a little bit tough to move around. So I'll switch to what we have on the questions here. And again, thanks folks for jumping in on the chat. That was fun to get your thoughts around the whether there's risks or not. But Rafik he's asking, can you provide points on how to quantify reputational impacts and dollar value? So Doug Hubbard's book, How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk, I think chapter 5, he's got a whole section on this, right? Part of this, you can go look at stock is one way to start to quantify what the reputational value is. That if I take a reputational hit, there's loss of value in the company from that perspective. It's funny that you bring it up, though. We are actually having internal discussions even at Archer on what this means from, if you're familiar with ESG, right, environmental, social, and governance. These are more qualitative scores, and how is that going to start to, move into reputation of organizations. And that can actually impact their companies that are vying to stay in these ESG portfolios. So there's some level of study we're doing around that, and very interested if you folks want to reach out. I want to continue that discussion. Not so big in the States yet, but I know big in Europe, and I'm quite sure up in Canada, that discussion is coming up quite a bit. So I do think there's some reputational impact from that perspective that we would see, hey, if I'm not included in this ESG portfolio because, these scores or the quote unquote perception of my organization is poor, again, you're back to there is some loss magnitude and dollar value there. But it does get more difficult, especially when you start talking about human life and that perspective. So we're doing some work around dealing with reputation. Stay tuned for that. There's some pretty healthy debates going on with inside Archer on how we can improve our quantification around this. So Olivia, thank you. Yeah, so that's Rafik. I've done some work with the governments. It gets trickier, right? Because you have the different constituencies, and unless the government is pulling it into a metric, I mean, the real negative thing is somebody may get voted out of office. It's something I'd like to explore more. I haven't thought about it as much in the public sector. I've been doing more work down in the States around our new CMMC program that's coming out of the Department of Defense. That's starting to merge some of the public sector management of risk more into the private sector, where organizations are contractors to the government. But I'd have to think about that some more. I don't have a good answer, and maybe we could have a whole separate chat on that somewhere. Plenty of time left here. Any other questions? Curious as to, how many people are using, I mean, do you even have this? These are things to think about. Where is the risk register for my organization? right? And go look at it in terms of some of the things we discussed out. So there's that piece of it. You can also look at how are you actually doing the quantification of it. If you don't have those ordinal scale, if you're just using those 1 through 5 ordinal scales, I highly suggest pulling that white paper. And that was actually out of the oil and gas industry. I can't remember who actually sponsored that research, but it's very good from that perspective. And you'll start to get an understanding of the level of maturity within your organization and how some of those things can be improved. And there are groups that are putting time and support out there into organizations to help them mature through this. I do have one. Risk tolerance and risk appetite are often confused. So risk appetite, typically, it's better to have it in dollar values, and it's sometimes, again, it's an ephemeral value when you're talking with leadership. They'll say, hey, that's too much, from what we're willing to take as a particular loss on any particular risk that's out there. And that's generally, when I've seen it, risk appetite is more of what the actual dollar value is that's at risk. The risk tolerance is, for me, where you get into the evaluation of these different trade-offs and options, and really on that front level of triage, right? Am I going to move something into an accepted risk, right? Versus, you only have 5 things you can do with the risk, 4 or 5, right? So I can either accept it, I can stop doing it, right? Avoid it. I can transfer it through insurance, or I can mitigate it, right? And outside of that, that's really that's where the tolerance comes into play. As you're making those decisions as an organization, what's the overall perspective as you're pushing that down through their culture. So for me, that's the difference. When you get to appetite, you're actually talking about, how much are we willing to lose dollar-wise on any particular risk, where the tolerance is more of how you're doing that initial classification and part of that triage. A question on the difference between a risk log and a risk register. That's interesting. I haven't heard those two different terms. I would assume they're interchangeable. There is a chance people are using the term risk log. It probably could be the issues log that you're using to then determine if there's actual risk there, or that concept that, hey, go ahead and log everything that you think is a risk. And then the second line of defense can come out, or through some tooling. Let's get back to those questions we were talking about. You've got something in this log here. Before we move it into the register, help me understand really what you're talking about. And you said cloud computing's a risk, Chris. What does that really mean? Well, we got everything in the cloud. Well, which things in the cloud are you most worried about? Well, I'm worried about shipping and tracking going down. Okay, well, what happens if we lose that for 2 or 3 days? Right, so that may be where that concept of a log versus a register is coming in. Good question from Jay here. Do you see organizations using speed of onset and velocity metrics, and is there value in using it? I have not, personally, because again, the domains I'm typically involved in, from logistics and manufacturing, I haven't seen that really moved into practice. But obviously, it's one of those more advanced kind of topics in quantification that if you can add those metrics to it, that it gives you a sense that this particular threat is going to expand rapidly, or have greater impact as it continues to go on. Those could absolutely be factored into the modeling, but you're leaving kind of FAIR doesn't really take that into account. You're kind of building your own models at that point, which is perfectly acceptable. And in some industries, you have to do it right. I think about critical infrastructure and potential loss of human life, and it's a very different world than the industries I've typically worked in. So I'm sure that they're doing quite a bit of that. So we're running out of a little bit of time here. Anything else, guys, before we close it out? I think we're getting close. I think that's it. Hopefully everybody enjoyed that. I did see some existing customers. Feel free to message me on LinkedIn. I think Jeff Falls, the rep up there in Calgary for the one company that was mentioned, but just reach out to me directly on LinkedIn, and I will get you in touch with the sales rep, or just my email address, cpat@rsa.com. Work with the reps quite frequently. And then I come in and work more on the strategic level of programs and kind of what direction, if it's a cultural shift you're looking for, if it's just some best practices and things along that line. That's very lucky. I get to take my knowledge out and share with a lot of organizations. So again, we had a lot of attendees in here. Very good to see a virtual event attended this well. Super excited, and hopefully be back to talk soon. My last talk was in Halifax in person. That's almost been 2 years ago now, so I really miss getting up there, and hope to see everybody up in Winnipeg and in the Western region here pretty soon. So thanks so much, and I appreciate it.